Hello everyone, my name is Lesley Jones and I'm the Director of Archives and Curation here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. My fascination with the spooky side of history, particularly witchcraft, has been with me since childhood. But have you ever really looked into the history of witches? The real history? Beyond Hocus Pocus, Mad Madam Mim, or the Wicked Witch of the West? With the help of the History Department at the University of North Georgia, we will embark on a journey through the history of witches, starting with ancient Greece and ending with practicing witches today. Historian Simeon Mizaki aptly noted that witchcraft and witches have varying interpretations depending on the region's culture. Today, we will be focusing on witches from Europe and the Americas and how the ideology of witchcraft fluctuates throughout the regions. Because the term for someone who performs witchcraft and magic differs so much in ancient history, I will be using the term witch throughout the program. Let's jump into this enthralling journey of the historical evolution of the witch, exploring its significance across cultures and contexts. The word witch, as we know today, made its first appearance in written history in the 9th century. The word is a fusion of two Old English words, Wicca, meaning sorcery, and Wiccan, to cast a spell. However, the concept of witches goes as far back as ancient Persia. Within Europe, it begins in Greek mythology. Stories of gods and goddesses, monsters, and adventures began around 700 BC.
At least in the Greek world, explains the origins of creation all the way down to the development of humans. Most of our hard sources for that comes from a writer named Hesiod, who lays out the foundation. And that's roughly in the 700 BC. In these stories, so mythos, story, are lessons to be learned about what we should be doing.
The lessons are carried out using the 12 Olympian gods and goddesses. Of these 12, there were goddesses who could perform magic and are today's idea of a witch.
So in a general sense, the concept of witchcraft, if we will, we have to strip all of the negativity away from it, all of it. When we're talking about, at least in the Greek world, there's a whole host of words, for example, and it all kind of comes around a general concept of, so magic and sorcery, right? So magia, a term meaning magic, we think goes actually further back to the east, further in time and distance back to the east. Think of the magi in the Persian Zoroastrian system. These are priests who, through various rituals and incantations, would communicate with the various gods and lower spirits of Ahura Mazda, the god of light.
Ahura Mazda, translated as Lord of Wisdom, first appeared in Persia 2 centuries prior to the emergence of magic and witchcraft in Greece. Some scholars believe that Ahura Mazda might have been based on the Hindu deity Varuna, as documented in the Vedas, which date back even further to 1500 to 1200 BCE. The Zoroastrians saw Ahura Mazda as their god, who was engaging in a never-ending battle with the evil spirit Ahriman. The ancient Zoroastrians believed in astronomy, astrology, and the power of magic.
This stuff makes its way to the West, and that word magi, or magia in Greek, and with magia comes this kind of a concept of those who work in that. So sorcery is a word we're going to use for the concept of our modern audience, which means the ability to pull things together and use words and sound, so music, and things, so your potions, to get things, to make things happen. And that making things happen are a whole host of things.
The potions made from herbs could be mixed into drinks, put in stews, or soaked in water and rubbed onto the skin.
The most common kind of thing you would see somebody to give you a potion to do something is for someone to fall in love with you. We all want to be wanted. Today we put on cologne and perfume, or we send a card or flowers. There it was like, give them something to drink.
Gods and goddesses, men and women, were using magia and were known as pharmakis.
Now, what's starting to happen, at least in the few court cases that we have in the Athenian world, is the emergence of at least one famous court trial where a homeopathic, healer, a woman by the name of Theoris, is put on trial for being a pharmakis. That's the word they use. And for the first time, at least in the records that we can see, that's a negative use of the word.
Theoris was a woman who lived in Athens in the 4th century. Statesman and orator Demosthenes called Theoris a filthy sorceress and a wicked evildoer. Although the exact reasons of her trial remain unclear, an Athenian historian who documented the trial years later suggested that Theoris committed asabia, a crime for the desecration and mockery of divine objects and dead ancestors. Theoris and her children were sentenced to death in 323 BC. This trial is considered the very first witch trial in ancient Greece.
And so there we have a negative attribute to that word. From that point on, pharmakis starts to take, in legal kind of, let's say, parlance, it starts to take a negative edge. Hekate or Hekate is a kind of a more primordial force in the early so she first appears in, like I said, the 7th century piece by the guy named Hesiod, who we call Hesiod, in a work called Theogony, which is basically the gods.
Hekate was one of the Olympic goddesses and is represented as triple formed with 3 bodies standing back to back, in part so she could look in all directions at once from the crossroads. We see representations of her all throughout history, including 3 plays by William Shakespeare: A Summer Night's Dream, King Lear, and Macbeth.
If there's a goddess to be, it's probably her. She's given the power over everything in terms of the universe. Night, she's associated with night, but she's everything in the sky, everything on the land. Her symbols are torch, and she has some keys. She can unlock doors and enter into new kind of areas, things like that. The more negative images we have of the pharmaki or the witches are often described as they're worshipers of her, right? So it's not necessarily that she is the active agent doing everything, but people come to see her sort of like in the background, an influencer, if you will, or one to call upon. There are shrines set up everywhere for her in the area of Thessaly in Greece from the 6th century on. It appears she is the god that people worship. As time moves on, writers and storytellers, playwrights, things like that, are infusing her into these other stories that will be written about people who do more negative things with their pharmakon abilities, with their abilities to conjure up things.
Hekate remains a prominent figure in popular culture. Shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the Assassin's Creed franchise, and the magical world of Harry Potter. Another goddess infused into the negative side of witches is Circe, the daughter of the sun god Helios and the ocean nymph Perse. Circe was well versed in transfiguration, illusion, and sorcery.
She shows up right there in these foundational Greek stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey. But more specifically in the Odyssey, she is on an island by herself and apparently has extraordinary powers, but the way it's described, she has this sort of palace, very lush, jungle-ish area, and there's all these docile animals around, lions and things like that. And what she does is she woos people in with her voice. And this is another kind of thing about the incantations of a pharmaki. They sing out their prayers or their incantations, and the men come in, and then she sits them down and gives them a potion. And then at the last minute, she pulls out her thuris or her wand and she whaps them or she waves, and they turn into various creatures. So Odysseus comes back. He needs to rescue his men, and he doesn't know what to do. But Hermes shows up and says, "This is how you do it. I'm going to give you a potion." So you have potion against potion here, and it'll render you safe against hers. And just before she waves her wand, you need to pull out your sword and threaten her. Don't kill her, but threaten her, subdue her. But the representation of Circe there is really interesting. Independent, obviously wealthy, powerful. Left unchecked, look what she does. And it takes a man, a confident man, a brave man, a man willing to sacrifice himself for his fellows, to be the husband in this, to add that balance. I think at the very least, there's a fear of independent women. In the ancient Greek world, women weren't full citizens. They didn't have legal rights like male citizens in the Athenian model that we're looking at. Okay, it's a remarkable kind of transformation in terms of subduing this powerfully wild, very dangerous entity.
The witch, along with magic and the influence of Zoroastrianism, continued into ancient Rome. In Roman mythology, the counterpart to the Greek goddess Hekate was the goddess known as Trivia. Trivia is also triple-formed and holds dominion of the underworld. Hekate and Trivia share a similar story associated with the underworld. Here is Dr. Prue again.
There's a mother-daughter team, Demeter and Persephone. They love each other very much. They can't be separated. And Hades, the god of the underworld, falls in love and gets smitten by Persephone, and so he kidnaps her, takes her away. Hecate helps her by going descent, because she's associated with the night. She knows her way around things. Her symbols are torch, and she has some keys. She can unlock doors and enter into new kind of areas, things like that. She lights the way sorry, there was a sound there. She lights the way to find Persephone.
In the Roman story, there is a mother-daughter team, Ceres and Proserpina. Pluto, the god of the underworld, falls in love, kidnaps Proserpina, and Trivia uses her powers to assist Ceres in locating her daughter. Trivia, like Hecate, was also associated with magic. It's during the rise of Christianity and the decline of paganism we see more denunciation of magic and divination. In the 7th century, Archbishop Isidore of Saville wrote that all magic originated from the instruction of evil angels. He labeled all practitioners of the dark arts as witches. He wrote that witches possess the power to disturb the minds of men and kill without the use of poison. This portrayal of witches was incorporated into the Theodosian Code in the late 4th century. The Theodosian Code was made to codify all the laws from the reigns of Constantine I to Theodosian I. There are 16 volumes and took almost a decade to complete. Within the codes are laws denouncing paganism, which, during this period, was a generic term for any non-Christian faith. The code prohibited going to temple, eradicated pagan festivals, and decreed that practicing witchcraft could result in death. The Burgundian Code, a set of laws made by the Germanic peoples within the Roman Empire, declared that witchcraft was one of only 3 viable reasons for divorce. It is in the Burgundian Code that we see the witch becoming a feminine word and meant as a derogatory term, as offensive as a woman being called a harlot. As we make our way into the medieval period, Dr. Thomas Green discusses the influence of paganism and magic in the Middle Ages.
The influence is certainly there. I think it's indirect, though. Medieval people certainly knew about classical stories and texts. They copied them out in their scriptoria in monasteries. They warned people not to lapse back into paganism in their sermons. But they tended to subsume pagan or classical ideas under the umbrella of diabolical activity. A good example of this is a text written by Regino of Prum in 906. And in that text, Regino tells a story of a group of women that he has heard about who, he says, claim that they meet at night and they ride on the backs of various animals under the command and authority of Diana, obeying her as if she were a lady, that is, a noblewoman. And at first, it seems like this might be evidence of some sort of concern about lapsing back into paganism. There's an idea of a magical gathering at night that might resemble what we expect from witches and witchcraft. So I think we see that kind of indirect influence filtering into and translated for a Christian context.
During the 8th century, we see another written law highlighting the punishable offense of witchcraft. Scholars have suggested that the Council of Paderborn was established to create new codes for the region that resisted conversion to Christianity after they were conquered. The law said anyone who, blinded by the devil, heathen-wise should believe a person to be a witch and man-eater, and should on that account have burned him or eaten his flesh, or given it to others to eat. Charlemagne, known as the Father of Europe, approved this law in the 780s.
Nonetheless, Charlemagne is this towering figure in European history. The Carolingians are an important family in European history. European nation states, France and Germany, both look back to Charlemagne in some way as their historic ancestor.
Charlemagne was the king of Franks, the king of Lombards, and the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Although I don't think of him as being in particular anti-magic, I do think, however, of one of his bishops, and bishop who also served under his son Louis, Agobard of Lyon, who did write 2 treatises in the early 9th century against the magical beliefs of the peasantry. His most famous text in this regard is called On Hail and Thunder, and that text is the description of peasant belief that there were people who lived in their village communities called tempestarii. These weather wizards were kind of wandering around the countryside in a protection racket, soliciting money from peasants under the threat of knocking their crops down to be stolen. It's important to note that he never uses the word witches or the term witchcraft. It is simply the devil working through them to deceive Christians. Christians should instead seek the protection of the church, give their money in alms instead of giving it to these weather wizards. There's one other case from the 9th century. There was a woman, her name was Gerberga. She was an abbess of a monastery, an unlikely person to be a witch.
Gerbera was also daughter of the Duke of Bavaria and a niece to Emperor Otto I. Gondersheim Abbey was known for its hospital, library, and school. Royals sent their children to the abbey to be educated, all during the time that Gerbera was an abbess.
She was accused of sorcery, among a number of other things, was found guilty, was nailed, sealed inside a barrel, and that barrel was thrown in the Sound River, and she was drowned. And so that has some of the elements of later witchcraft beliefs and practices, throwing witches in water.
However, the accusations and trials of witchcraft are few and far between. Pop culture has us thinking that the medieval period is this time of magic, sorcery, wizards, and damsels in distress, which is just not the case.
So there were no witches as a defined group of people in the Middle Ages. There were people who were accused of things that remind us of what we know about witchcraft. We tend to use the Middle Ages as a time where we can create an alternative space for all the things that we either don't like about ourselves, don't want to believe ourselves to be. And so because we think of ourselves as modern, and we begin that modern historical trajectory in the early modern period, we tend to locate phenomena like witchcraft that don't match that narrative of modernity, of the immersion. We tend to locate things that are anti-modern in the Middle Ages, even if, as in this case, they are wholly historically located in the beginning of our notion of modernity and of progress.
There are some parts of these medieval narratives that take place from folklore and religion, such as the Stringoi in The Witcher or the Zoroastrian mythology in Game of Thrones. But in history, the witch and the negative connotations we know of today did not emerge until the end of the Middle Ages. Why does it rise in this period? What makes it turn into mass hysteria?
So I think the short answer is nobody exactly knows why Europeans began to use this idea of witchcraft and create the concept of a person who does it, a specific person who does it, a witch, in the 15th century. But we certainly do see a change in Europeans' attitudes towards magic and witchcraft in the very early 15th century. We see it kind of expressed at the end of the 15th century with the famous publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the first kind of witch hunting treatise.
In 1486, a German clergyman named Heinrich Kramer wrote the Malleus Maleficarum, translated as the Hammer of Witches. The book explains how to identify a witch and how they are a threat to society. This book could be characterized as a tale of retribution. 2 years earlier, Kramer made accusations of witchcraft in the mountainous region of Tyrol. The witch hunt was an utter failure. The people viewed him old and senile and banished him from the area. Scholars remain divided on the reasons why the Malleus Maleficarum was taken seriously after the clergyman's previous endeavor.
People began to write their own witch hunting, anti-witchcraft treatises. This idea of the enemy of the faith became a moving target that people in power with coercive authority could deploy, and that people subject to power were convinced were real. A medieval kind of if you see something, say something culture. And witches became part of that all of these various beliefs and practices that had been created in the early Middle Ages, described as witchcraft, moved out of that rhetorical mode where they were just an activity that people who were deviant did at times, and that most people who were accused of deviance did not do ever. And they became a characteristic of a certain type of person, and that type of person is the witch. And it takes witchcraft from an idea or a concept or an action, and it reifies it, it makes it real.
We know that the Malleus Maleficarum had an impact on mass hysteria in the 15th century. Another very important cause, the Protestant Reformation. Here to talk about this bloody period in the early modern period is Dr. Joanna Luthman.
So the Reformation belongs to the 1500s. It's a movement of the 1500s and into the 1600s. And it's a time when Christianity in Western and Central Europe divides into two sections. Protestantism essentially challenged Catholic dogma in a variety of ways. Some of the major Reformation leaders like Martin Luther and John Calvin, they are protesting the church. Luther thought he could reform it from within. He was very much part of the church. He was an ordained priest and a monk. He could not go along with his new theology, so he was cast out. So that's when you get the breach, essentially. But you have warfare in Europe for a good century, from the half point of the 1500s to the half point of the 1600s, very bloody wars. For Catholics, Protestantism was a kind of heresy. For Protestants, Catholicism is a kind of heresy. And for both, witchcraft is a kind of heresy. So it's a false belief, right? It's turning away from God and turning to the devil. Most historians would argue that the Reformation period, the reason why you see this heightened witchcraft activity is because you have this heightened awareness of, what's the right belief and what falls outside of the right belief. You still have people writing and arguing about the reality of witchcraft and the necessity of understanding that witchcraft is real in the latter half of the 1600s.
But before we get into the intense court proceedings and violent history that followed the Reformation, there is a man during this period that, although he is known to perform magic, was never accused of witchcraft. This man, an advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, is John Dee.
So John Dee was a scientist, essentially, right? So he was a mathematician and an astronomer and an astrologer. There was not the division between the two either at the time. And he was also very interested in alchemy, which is the art of making base materials into gold and silver, into precious metals, through means of magic, essentially. He was university educated. He did predominantly astrological work for Queen Elizabeth, and he was a scientific advisor, essentially. She would ask him questions about things like, when is a good time to do things? Like, what would be a good date for the ceremony, or what would be a good time to, push this policy, or something like that. And he would look at the stars, essentially, right, and tell him when would be a good time.
Queen Elizabeth I trusted John Dee, seemingly without question. He even picked the date of her coronation. Dee was her advisor for 20 years, making potions and predictions. And yet, thousands of men and women are dying during this time from accusations of witchcraft. It makes you wonder, what made John Dee different from the others?
John Dee was especially interested in communicating with angels, and he thought that this was the way to learn about the universe, essentially. As a result, his magic was seen as scientific rather than, this kind of harmful magic. John Dee did get in trouble one time during the reign of Queen Mary because he was sort of foretelling her future, not to her, but he was doing it on his own. And that, since the reign of King Henry VIII, foretelling, for example, the death of the king was a kind of treason. And he was questioned by a Star Chamber Court, which was the High Criminal Court, but he was acquitted.
After John Dee went on to pursue more knowledge of the world, the Queen appointed him the warden of Christ College in Manchester. Another group performing good magic during this period in England were cunning folk. Here is Dr. Philip Gertie on the somewhat perplexing history of cunning folk.
You have to, if you understand cunning folk, you have to understand the context in which people lived. So it was, to put it bluntly, miserable, right? So there's lots of diseases. Tragedy could strike at any time. It's in that context that cunning folk really, I think, play an important cultural, social role.
Cunning folk were conjuring good magic to help others, and sometimes would help detect evil magic in others.
So cunning folk were not considered to be the same thing as witches. So if you wanted like a good luck charm, a cunning person could do that for you. Also, they would offer divination. Now, these are common everyday village divination. And the things that people wanted to know, kind of like we would like to know today, who are we going to marry? Who are we going to fall in love with, right? Are we going to have good fortune in the future?
Like in ancient Greece, potions were commonly used for love and good fortune. And like John Dee, it was considered good magic. But I have to ask again, why are they good?
And I think this is where cunning folk probably differ from your stereotypical witch, even though that's very complex and varied as well. But cunning folk generally provided some sort of protection or help, right? Where witches were seen as destructive. And so people naturally, if things started to go awry on the farm or something, and they needed somebody to blame, they would blame a witch. Well, how do you counter a witch's magic? You counter it with a cunning folk's magic, in a sense. So they would offer protection from witches, but also protection just from evil spirits.
Cunning folk were labeled as good because they could save you from the perils of the witch. As Dr. Gertie points out, they also were considered good because of their ability to help with villager disputes.
And then also one thing, probably the most frequent thing besides the protection was finding lost or stolen stuff, right? And so somebody would go to a cunning person to try to find if they lost something or if they thought something was stolen. To that point, cunning folk were also consulted to find like a guilty party. They're both using magic, and magic is sort of a violation of God's laws. But most people didn't see them that way. And I think they didn't see them that way because they saw them as offering something good, not something bad.
While cunning folk were practicing magic across England, we have to remember that the Reformation is going on at the same time. Here is Dr. Luthman again.
So because of the chaos created by the Reformation, there is this idea that you get this sort of heightened sense that the devil is especially active in the world and is trying to lead people astray.
With the Malleus Maleficarum published and in the hands of the fearful, the accusations started.
So accusations are generally just sort of interpersonal. So the accusations, the way it happens often is somebody accuses somebody of witchcraft, and oftentimes it's not just because one thing happened, right? It is because somebody has been associated with multiple bad things happen. Something bad happens, a child gets sick, livestock dies or something like that. And then, or sometimes it's more trivial, the butter won't churn or the beer won't brew, or something like that. There's a disruption in the house. And if that happens multiple times, you might get an accusation of witchcraft. And then if there was determined that there was cause to hold them, they would generally put them in gaol and prison until you would get the circuit court come through.
Various methods were used to get the accused to confess to witchcraft. Johannes Eunice, who was executed as a witch in 1628, wrote to his daughter, "Innocent, I came to jail. Innocent, I was tortured. Innocent, I must die. The executioner came and put the thumbscrews on me, both hands bound together, so that the blood ran out at the nails and everywhere, so that for 4 weeks I could not use my hands. Thereafter, they first stripped me, bound my hands behind me, and drew me up in the torture. Then I thought heaven and earth were at an end. 8 times did they draw me up and let me fall again, so that I suffered horrible agony." Another method was witches' marks. Birthmarks of irregular shape or color could be considered a physical sign of a pact with the devil. The mark would be tested to see if it changed shape and if it was sensitive to pain. One of the most well-known tests of witchcraft was swimming a witch.
Some of them would have trial by ordeal in the sense that you would do tests like, swimming a witch. Swimming is putting somebody in water, tying them up and putting them in water and see if they will sink or swim. The idea was that if the water had been blessed by a priest initially, then the water would reject a witch. She would float, whereas an innocent person would be accepted by the blessed water and sink. It's you see it a lot in popular culture these ways, but they were not all that common.
Court trials were used more than physical testing. However, it varied by region.
And the trial by ordeal tends to belong a little bit more to the medieval period.
From 1550 to 1700, 80,000 people were accused of witchcraft, and half of them were guilty and executed. The accusations could be anyone at any time for literally anything. The Malleus Maleficarum states that since women are feebler both in mind and body, it is not surprising that they should come more under the spell of witchcraft.
And the idea was then that women are more likely to fall victim to the devil because they're more easily seduced. The reason why you see so many women accused of witchcraft definitely has to do with the fact that the kinds of crimes that witches are believed to commit are often tied to female tasks, or what was considered female tasks at the time. So oftentimes it's harm to children, especially smaller infants. And childbirth in the early modern period, at least in the late 15 and early 1600s, was an entirely female affair. There were no men in the room. There were no male doctors who were attending. It's all women. So you have women's roles as mother, caring for their children, and the witches are doing sort of the most evil thing then, in that they are hindering this or harming this.
When we hear these things that occurred, we have to wonder, how did all of these suspicions become fact? Was there an understanding of coincidence during this time?
But we also have to remember that this is a world where God is seen as active in the world at all times, and the devil is seen as active in the world at all times. For a lot of people, their kind of mental world was different, where they imbued meaning into everything, really.
The trials throughout Europe slowed down in the 1700s.
It doesn't disappear completely all at once, but it starts to peter out to a certain extent. But you still have sporadic trials in the later 1600s and even into the early 1700s, but they're going to be fewer and further between. And for the most part, those big witch hunts are over by then.
In another part of Europe at the same time, if not a little earlier, another infamous event was taking place, the Spanish Inquisition. Here is Dr. Alexander Wisnowski.
The Inquisition is one of these really popular moments, especially really popular in sort of pop culture, the Monty Python. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition, but the Holy Inquisition itself has a sort of a complicated origin, because for the Spanish side of things, it starts in the 15th century and particularly increases in its scrutiny, particularly of Jews and Muslims who were living in Iberia, as that really became, those belief systems became outlawed. But it was its own court system, essentially, that was prioritizing Catholic orthodoxy. And so they were trying to eliminate, in all their creative and various and sometimes brutal ways, what were considered unorthodox belief systems and practices. And so some of the things that maybe in other contexts would have immediately resulted in an eruption from the community could be more negotiated, although we still do have instances in which these folks were insisting that they had visions or that they had word from some supernatural force. And so in those cases, it very much occupies the church, and particularly the Spanish Inquisition.
From 1480 to 1530, over 30,000 people died during the Spanish Inquisition. The intent of the Inquisition, at least at first, was to pursue heretics and convert them to Catholicism. Hundreds of thousands of Jews and Muslims were forced out of Spain, and those who stayed were either converted or were executed. While other parts of Europe, including neighboring France and Portugal, were hyper-focused on witchcraft, somehow the occult practice was rarely given any thought in Spain.
So the accusations of specifically witchcraft begin at least as early as the late 16th century in the Spanish American colonies, but it's not something where we could necessarily have a targeted 2 or 3 decade rupture of these moments. In fact, the only concentrated threat of something supernatural of that nature is actually the women mystics within the Spanish American colonies.
From 1610 to 1770, Cartagena was pursued by the Inquisition for witchcraft. 767 people were found guilty, but only 5 of those people died. Others were fined or sentenced to prison. The Spanish believed that with education and guidance, the witches could become model Catholics and in turn influence others to do the same. Like the Protestant Reformation, women were accused the most due to the fact that they were in control of the home.
Witchcraft and accusations of magic in general tended to veer towards women, and this ended up being an interesting dynamic in a lot of cases because it almost became a problem as the actions were seeming to almost like upset the hierarchy.
A man named Juan de Fuentes went to the inquisitors alleging his wife of witchcraft. He believed that she was controlling him in order to get out of housework. Normally, his wife made the meals and served her husband drinking chocolate, a staple in Latin America. Her husband claimed that she used magic to compel him to do the chores, including making chocolate for her. The court sided with Juan, stating on the record that it was not natural. His wife was then sent to jail. Women were often accused of poisoning men's drinking chocolate in order to gain power.
And a lot of scholars point to the way that these women found ways to assert themselves in a community that wanted to prioritize patriarchal authority. And so when that gets upset, that's when these officials need to jump into action.
Many of these witches that lived in Latin America were indigenous, but some were slaves brought over from Africa.
The transatlantic slave trade is bringing African slaves forcibly to the New World as early as ships are landing in the Caribbean right after Columbus, after his first voyages. And so as those communities are coming in, they're also bringing with them their belief systems, their cultural values, right, their practices. As enslaved Africans engage and interact more with people of indigenous descent, mixed race peoples, you certainly begin to see the ways that these different cultures come together and create something new, right? A lot of scholars will refer to this as the hybridization of Latin America, which we see in things like cuisine, in music, but also in religious systems and rituals. These things can come together to create something new, even if we can look back in its heritages and see elements of it that originate in Africa, that originate with the indigenous peoples and their values.
Cultural hybridization occurs throughout history, and I think it's especially prevalent in regions with African slaves. That is where we begin our look at what could be the most popular, most talked about witch trials in American history, the Salem witch trials. Here is Dr. Luhman to discuss the trials.
The witch panic in Salem, you had also had some trauma, associated with recent wars with Native Americans and French.
King William's War, part of the 9 Years' War theater, was a battle between New France, New England, and the indigenous peoples within the region. This tumultuous period led to scarcities of essential resources in towns and villages along the East Coast, including Salem. This war was raging on during the infamous witch trials, exacerbated by a multitude of diseases such as smallpox, malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, and among many others. Combining the poor crop growth of the season, the war, and the seemingly never-ending bout of disease, the stage was set for the Salem trials. The cultural hybridization is evident in the case of Tituba, an African slave, and the accusations of witchcraft by the townspeople.
She was enslaved in West India and she'd been inherited by the Paris family, and so she was brought to New England. Yeah, so it starts with her essentially, right, in the sense that she is the one who's initially accused of having bewitched these girls or taught others also about witchcraft. And she's arrested early on. The thing is, she confesses. But her confession is not particularly, consistent. She confesses to different things at different times.
Tituba, one of the only people to confess to being a witch, was not one of the 25 that were executed. There are theories as to why.
We don't know exactly why she was never put on trial, but it's probably because she was going to be used as a witness. And probably also because her confessions were very confusing and it didn't make for a great narrative, right? And in the witchcraft trials, for the prosecutors, it was often important to get a clear narrative of what had happened.
200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem Village. Unlike the trials in Europe and Latin America, this witch hunt was quick.
And all of this happens within a few months. And then the trials are held in the summer of 1692.
Mather recounted experiences with another family whose children claimed that they could see the specter of their mother before they were attacked. While Cotton Mather believed that spectral evidence should not be used in court, the girls in the Salem trials, Mercy Lewis and Ann Putnam, declared that the specter of Bridget Bishop and others in the trials were hurting them. However, things changed quickly when a shocking accusation occurred.
when there is more oversight over the trial. And also the accusations have grown outside of Salem Village. They get into Salem Town, and somebody accuses even the governor's wife. Like at this point, it gets really noticed by authorities in a different way. And then people start to pay attention a little bit more to the evidence. But generally it ends then because it starts to spiral out of control when it's starting to seem very surprising to people, some of the ones who are getting accused, especially once it starts to climb up into the upper socioeconomic levels, like the governor's wife.
While the upper class women were safe, as we have learned throughout the history of witches, most women were not so lucky. This goes for ancient Greece, for the Reformation, for every period we discuss. Even in the modern 19th century, these accusations continue against women. Here again is Dr. Gertie.
So, for instance, in the 19th century, there's a story of a husband who was so afraid of his mother-in-law who had passed and thought that she was trying to, out to poison him or something like that from beyond the grave. And so, ironically, you see more prosecutions in the 19th century for people practicing these cunning ways. And it's not because they're cursing someone, because they don't believe in curses anymore. It's for conning people.
Helen Duncan, a spiritualist medium from Scotland, was the last woman in history to be accused of witchcraft under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. This incident occurred in 1933 during a seance when a spirit materialized. During the seance, one of the guests grabbed the apparition, revealing it to be Helen Duncan. The guest contacted the police, leading to her arrest that very night. Her trial took place in 1944, and Mrs. Duncan was sentenced to 9 months in prison. This court case contributed to the repeal of the Witchcraft Act in Britain. However, it gave rise to a new law, the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. This act prevented mediums from conning others. Fast forward to present day, 2023, where we enjoy the freedom to practice any religion of our choosing, including paganism, without fear of legal persecution or physical harm. Sani, an active practitioner of witchcraft, graciously shared insights into the contemporary aspects of her magical practices. She wrote to me and said, "My favorite spells are for protection and glamour. I like to use spells to protect my home, plus it makes the house smell nice. It cleanses the house of bad energy and covers the space in a blanket of protection." She also said, "I often enchant my perfume or jewelry to help me feel confident and beautiful. I'll charge them under moonlight, mix in a few herbs, or charge them with crystals. I also enjoy carrying a crystal with me throughout the day for a little extra good energy." At the start of the program, we discussed the varying cultural perspectives on witches. We explored the distinctions and similarities in how Europe and the Americas perceive witches. I believe that contemporary witches like Sani can offer insights into learning tolerance and acceptance of others. Thank you so much for joining me in this magical journey. I want to thank Guada Rodriguez, the most amazing producer a gal could ask for, and to the professors at the University of North Georgia for their help in making this program possible. This is the last video in Lesley's October takeover, so if you like it, please let us know. We might be working on another takeover in 2024.